Part 7, Chapter 5 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Two very interesting pieces were to be given at the matinee. One was a fantasia or symphonic poem called The King Lear of the Steppes. The other was a quartet dedicated to the memory of Bach. Both pieces were new and of the new school, and Levin desired to form his own opinion in regard to them. So, after he had conducted his sister-in-law to her place, he took his stand near a column, and determined to listen as attentively and conscientiously as possible. He tried not to allow his attention to be distracted and his impression spoiled by letting his eyes follow the white-cravated Kapellmeister's waving arms, which were always so disturbing to the musical attention, or by looking at the ladies in their hats, who for concerts take especial pains to tie ribbons round their ears, or at all the faces either occupied with nothing or occupied with the most heterogeneous interests, music being the last. He tried to avoid meeting the connoisseurs and the chatterers, but he stood alone by himself, looking down and listening. But the more he listened to the King Lear fantasia, the more he felt the impossibility of forming a clear and exact idea of it. The musical thought, at the moment of its development, was constantly interrupted by the introduction of new themes, or vanished, leaving only the impression of a complicated and laborious attempt at instrumentation. But these same new themes, beautiful as some of them were, gave an unpleasant impression, because they were not expected or prepared for. Gaiety and sadness and despair and tenderness and triumph followed one another like the incoherent thoughts of a madman, to be themselves followed by others as wild. During the whole performance Levin experienced a feeling analogous to what a deaf man might have in looking at dancers. He was in a state of utter dubiety when the piece came to an end, and he felt a great weariness from the strain of intellectual intensity which was never rewarded. On all sides were heard loud applause and clapping of hands. All got up and moved about, talking. Wishing to get some light on his doubts by the impressions of others, Levin began to walk about, seeking for the connoisseurs, and he was glad when at last he saw one of the best-known musical critics talking with his friend Pestov. "It's wonderful," said Pestov in his deep bass. "How are you, Konstantin Dmitrich? The passage that is the richest in color, the most statuesque, so to speak, is that where Cordelia appears, where woman, das ewig Weibliche, comes into conflict with fate. Don't you think so?" "Why Cordelia?" asked Levin with hesitation, for he had wholly forgotten that the symphonic poem had anything to do with King Lear. "Cordelia appears here," said Pestov, tapping with his finger on the satin program which he held in his hand. Then only did Levin notice the title of the symphonic poem, and he made haste to read the text of Shakespeare, translated into Russian and printed on the back of the program. "You can't follow it without that," said Pestov, addressing Levin, now that his friend the critic had gone, and there was nothing more to talk with him about. Levin and Pestov spent the intermission in discussing the merits and defects of the Wagnerian tendencies in music. Levin maintained that the mistake of Wagner and all his followers consisted in transferring music to the domain of an alien art, that poetry made the mistake when it tried to depict the features of the human face, which was the province of painting to do, and as a concrete example of this kind of a mistake he adduced the sculptor who should try to express in marble the shades of poetic imagery rising round the figure of the poet on the pedestal. "These shades are so far from being shades in the case of the sculptor, that they even rest on the steps," said Levin. This phrase pleased him, but he had a lurking suspicion that he had once used this same phrase before, and to Pestov himself, and he felt confused. Pestov argued that art is one, and that it can reach its loftiest manifestations only by combining all its forms. Levin could not listen to the second number on the program. Pestov, who was standing near him, kept talking to him most of the time, criticizing it for its excessive, mawkish, affected simplicity, and comparing it to the simplicity of the pre-Raphaelites in painting. On his way out he met various acquaintances, with whom he exchanged remarks on politics, music, and other topics. Among others he saw Count Bohl, and the call which he should have made on him came to mind. "Well, go quickly," said Natalie, to whom he confided this. "Perhaps the countess is not receiving. If so, you will come and join me at the meeting. You have plenty of time." Chapter 6. Part 7, Chapter 6 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. "Perhaps they are not receiving?" asked Levin, as he entered the vestibule of Count Bohl's house. "Oh, yes, permit me," answered the Swiss, resolutely taking the visitor's shuba. "What a nuisance!" thought Levin, drawing off one of his gloves with a sigh, and turning his hat in his hands. "Now, why did I come? Now, what am I going to say to them?" Passing through the first drawing-room, he met the Countess Bohl at the door, who, with a perplexed and severe face, was giving orders to a servant. When she saw Levin, she smiled, and invited him to walk into a small parlor, where voices were heard. In this room were sitting her 2 daughters and a Muscovite colonel whom Levin knew. Levin joined them, passed the usual compliments, and sat down near a divan, holding his hat on his knee. "How is your wife? Have you been to the concert? We were not able to go. Mamma had to attend to the requiem," said one of the young ladies. "Yes, I heard about it. What a sudden death," said Levin. The countess came in, sat down on the divan, and asked also about his wife and the concert. Levin replied, and asked some questions about the sudden death of Madame Apraxin. "But then she was always in delicate health." "Were you at the opera yesterday?" "Yes, I was." "Lucia was very good." "Yes, very good," said he, and he began, seeing that it was entirely immaterial to him what they thought about him, to repeat what he had heard 100 times about the singer's extraordinary talent. The Countess Bohl pretended that she was listening. Then, when he had said all he had to say, and relapsed into silence, the colonel, who had hitherto held his peace, began also to speak. The colonel also talked about the opera, and about an illumination. Then, saying something about a supposititious folle journée at Turin, the colonel, laughing, got up and took his departure. Levin also got up, but a look of surprise on the countess's face told him that it was not yet time for him to go. 2 minutes more at least were necessary. He sat down. But, as he thought what a foolish figure he was cutting, he was more and more incapable of finding a subject of conversation. "Are you going to the public meeting?" asked the countess. "They say it will be very interesting." "No, but I promised my belle-sœur that I would call for her there," replied Levin. Silence again ensued. The mother exchanged a look with her daughter. "Now it must be time to go," thought Levin, and he rose. The lady shook hands with him, and charged him with 1000 choses for his wife. The Swiss, as he put on his shuba for him, asked his address, and wrote it gravely in a large, handsomely bound book. "Of course, it's always the same to me, but how useless and ridiculous it all is," thought Levin, comforting himself with the thought that every one did the same thing. And he went to the public meeting of the committee, where he was to find his sister-in-law to bring her home with him. At the public meeting of the committee there was a great throng of people, and society was well represented. Levin reached the place just in time to hear a sketch which all said was very interesting. When the reading of the sketch was finished, society came together, and Levin met Sviazhsky, who invited him to come that very evening to a meeting of the Society of Rural Economy, at which a very important report was to be read. He also met Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had just returned from the races, and many other acquaintances, and Levin talked much and heard many opinions relating to the meeting and the new piece and the lawsuit. But apparently in consequence of his weariness and the strain which he began to feel, he made a blunder in speaking of a certain lawsuit, and this blunder he afterward remembered with annoyance. Speaking of the recent punishment of a foreigner who had been tried in Russia, and that it would have been irregular to punish him by exile, Levin repeated what he had heard the evening before in a conversation with a friend of his. "I think that to send him abroad is just the same as to punish a fish by throwing it into the water," said Levin. Too late he remembered that his comparison which he put forth to express his thought, though he had heard his friend use it, was really taken from a fable by Kryloff, and that his friend had taken it from the feuilleton of a newspaper. Returning home with his sister-in-law, and finding Kitty well and happy, Levin went to the club. End of chapter 6. Part 7, Chapter 7 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Levin reached the club very punctually. A number of the guests and members arrived there at the same time as he did. Levin had not been at the club very recently, indeed, not since the time when, having finished his studies at the university, he passed a winter at Moscow and went into society. He remembered the club in a general sort of way, but had entirely forgotten the impressions which, in former days, it had made upon him. But as soon as he entered the great semicircular devour, or court, sent away his isvostchik, and mounted the steps and saw the liveried Swiss noiselessly open the door for him, and bow as he ushered him in, as soon as he saw in the cloak-room the goloshes and shubas of the members, who felt that it was less work to take them off downstairs and leave them with the Swiss than to wear them upstairs, as soon as he heard the well-known mysterious sound of the bell, and as soon as he mounted the easy flight of carpeted stairs and saw the statue on the landing, and on the upper floor recognized the third Swiss in his club livery, who, having grown older, displayed neither dilatoriness nor haste in opening the door for him, he once more felt the old-time impression of the club, the atmosphere of comfort, ease, and good breeding. "Your hat, if you please," said the Swiss to Levin, who had forgotten the rule of the club to leave hats at the cloak-room. "It's a long time since you were here," said the Swiss. "The prince wrote to you yesterday. Prince Stepan Arkadyevitch has not come yet." The Swiss knew not only Levin but all his connections and family, and took pleasure in reminding him of his relationships. Passing through the first connecting hall, and the conversation-room at the right where the fruit dealer sits, Levin, who walked faster than the old attendant, entered the dining-room, which was filled with a noisy throng. He made his way along by the tables, almost all of which were occupied. As he looked about him on all sides, he saw men of the most heterogeneous types, old and young, most of them acquaintances, and many of them friends. It seemed as if all of them had left their cares and worries with their hats in the cloak-room, and had collected together to make the most of the material advantages of life. There were Sviatsky and Shtcherbatsky and Nevyedovsky and the old prince and Vronsky and Sergey Ivanovitch. "Ah, why are you late?" said the prince with a smile, extending his hand to his son-in-law over his shoulder. "How is Kitty?" he added, putting a corner of his napkin into the buttonhole of his waistcoat. "She is well, and dining with her sisters." "Ah, the old gossips! Well, there's no room with us. Go to that table there and get a seat as quickly as you can," said the prince, taking care with a plate of ukha, or soup made of lotes. "Here, Levin!" cried a jovial voice from a table a little farther away. It was Turovtsin. He was sitting with a young officer, and near him were two chairs tilted up. Levin, with joy, went to join him. He always liked the good-hearted, prodigal Turovtsin. His reconciliation with Kitty was connected with him, and now, especially, after all his wearisome intellectual conversations, the sight of his jolly face was delightful. "These places were for you and Oblonsky. He will be here directly," said Turovtsin, and then he introduced Levin to the young officer, who held himself very straight and had bright, laughing eyes. "Gagin, from Petersburg." "Oblonsky is always late." "Ah, here he is." "You've only just come, haven't you?" asked Oblonsky of Levin, hurrying up to him. "Your health. Will you take vodka? Come on, then." Levin got up and went with him to a large table, on which all kinds of liquors and a most select zakuska were set out. It would seem as if the 24 different kinds of drinks might have offered a choice, but Stepan Arkadyevitch thought good to ask for a special concoction, which a servant in livery hastened to get for him. They drank it from small glasses, and then returned to their places. At the very first, even while they were eating their ukha, Gagin had champagne served, and he ordered the 4 glasses filled. Levin did not refuse the wine when it was offered to him, and he in turn ordered a bottle. He was hungry, and ate and drank with great satisfaction, and with still greater satisfaction took part in the gay and lively conversation of his neighbors. Gagin, lowering his voice, told a new Petersburg anecdote, and, though it was indecorous and ridiculous, it was so funny that Levin laughed uproariously till those around him looked at him in surprise. "That is in the same kind as 'Alas, I cannot endure it,'" quoted Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Do you remember? Ah, it was lovely. Bring us another bottle," said he to the lackey, and he began to tell an anecdote. "Pyotr Ilyitch Vinovsky sends these," interrupted a little old lackey, addressing Stepan Arkadyevitch, and bringing 2 diminutive glasses of bubbling champagne, and offering them to Oblonsky and Levin. Stepan Arkadyevitch took the glass, and, exchanging glances with a bald, ruddy, mustachioed man at the other end of the table, nodded to him and smiled. "Who is that?" asked Levin. "You met him at my house once. Don't you remember? He's a very good fellow." Levin followed Oblonsky's example, and took his glass. Stepan Arkadyevitch's anecdote was also very diverting. Then Levin had a story to tell, and it likewise raised a laugh. Then the conversation turned on horses, and the races that had taken place that day, and they told how brilliantly Vronsky's trotter, Atlas Nui, had won the first prize. "Ah, here they are," said Stepan Arkadyevitch toward the end of the dinner, turning round in his chair to extend his hand to Vronsky, who was walking with a tall colonel of the Guards. Vronsky's face was also radiant with the good-natured gaiety that reigned in the club. He leaned his elbow on Oblonsky's shoulder and whispered some words in his ear with an air of good humor, and extended his hand with a friendly smile to Levin. "I am very glad to meet you," said he. "I looked for you after the elections, but they told me you had gone." "Yes, I went away the same day. We have just been speaking of your trotter. It was a very fast race." "Yes, it was. Haven't you racehorses too?" "I? No. My father had horses, and I know about them." "Where did you dine?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. "At the second table, behind the columns." "He has been loaded down with congratulations. It's very pretty, a second imperial prize. I wish I could only have the same luck at play as he does with horses. Now, how they waste golden time. I am going to the infernal Naya," said the tall colonel, and he left them. "That's Yashvin," said Vronsky to Trotsuin, and sat down in a vacant place near them. Having drained the glass of champagne which was filled for him, he also ordered a bottle. Either from the effect of the wine which he had drunk, or from the social atmosphere of the club, Levin talked cordially with him about the best breeds of cattle, and was happy to feel no more hatred against his former rival. He even told him, among other things, that he had heard from his wife of the meeting which had taken place at the house of the Princess Marya Borissovna. "Ah, the Princess Marya Borissovna! She's a charmer!" exclaimed Stepan Arkadyevitch, and he told an anecdote of the old lady which made everyone laugh. Especially Vronsky laughed so heartily that Levin felt perfectly reconciled to him. "Well, gentlemen, have we finished?" said Oblonsky, getting up and smiling. "Then let us go." Chapter 7. Part 7, Chapter 8 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. On leaving the table, Levin, in company with Gagin, walked through the lofty rooms to the billiard room, and he felt that his walk was singularly straight and that his hands moved easily. In the large hall he met his father-in-law. "Well, and how do you like our temple of indolence?" asked the old prince, taking his son-in-law by the arm. "Come, take a turn." "I should like to look around. It is interesting." "Yes, to you, but my interest in it is different from yours. When you see old men like that," said he, indicating a member of the club who, with stooping shoulders and falling lip, was slowly shuffling along in soft boots across the hall, "you would think that they were born shlupiks." "Why do you call them little sloops?" "Here you are, and don't know what that means? That's our club term. You know how eggs roll. Well, When anyone goes with a gait like that, he becomes a schlupik. And so, when any one of us goes stumbling through the club, he becomes a schlupik. You laugh, do you? But one has to look out, else he finds himself one. Do you know Prince Tchetchensky?" he asked, and Levin saw by his face that he was going to tell some ridiculous yarn. "No, I don't know him." "Well, no matter. Prince Tchetchensky is famous. Well, that is neither here nor there. He's always playing billiards. 3 years ago he wasn't among the shlupiks, but was a great galliard. He himself called other people shlupiks. Only he came one time, but our Swiss, you know Vasily, our tall one, he is a great bonmotist. Prince Tchetchensky asked him, 'Well, Vasily, is anyone here yet? Have any shlupiks come?' And Vasily answers, 'You are the third.' Now, brother, how is that?" The two men walked on, chatting and greeting their friends, and passed through all the rooms. The main room, where men accustomed to one another as partners were playing cards for small stakes. The divan room, where others were having games of chess, and Sergey Ivanovitch was talking with someone. The billiard room, where in the bay of the room, around a divan, a gay party, among them Gagin, had gathered and were drinking champagne. They glanced in also at the infernal Naya, where, at the gambling table, Yashvin, surrounded by men betting, was already established. With hushed voices they entered the reading room, where, under a shaded lamp, a young man with a stern face was turning over the leaves of one journal after another, while near by was a bald-headed general absorbed in reading. They passed quietly into a room which the prince called the Hall of the Wits, and there they found 3 gentlemen talking politics. "Prince, we are ready, if you please," said one of his partners, finding him there, and the prince joined them. Levin sat down and listened to the 3 gentlemen, but, as he recalled all the conversations of the same kind he had heard since morning, he felt excessively bored. He got up and went off to find Turovtsin and Oblonsky, who were sure to be gay. Turovtsin was with the champagne drinkers on the high divan in the billiard room, and Stepan Arkadyevitch and Vronsky were talking in a corner near the door. "Not that she finds it tedious," Levin heard in passing, "but it's the uncertainty, the indefiniteness of her position." He was about to pass on discreetly, but Stepan Arkadyevitch called him. "Levin," said he, and Levin saw that there were in his eyes, not exactly tears, but moisture, as was always the case, either after he had been drinking or when he was touched, and just now it was both. "Levin, don't go," and he took him by the arm and detained him. "Here is my sincere, if not my best, friend," said he, addressing Vronsky. "You, too, are more like a kinsman and a friend to me. I want to bring you together and see you friends. You ought to be good friends, because you are both good men." "There's nothing left for us but to give the kiss of friendship," said Vronsky gaily, offering his hand to Levin, who pressed it cordially. "I'm very, very glad," said Levin. "Waiter, a bottle of champagne!" cried Stepan Arkadyevitch. "I am also very glad," said Vronsky. But in spite of Oblonsky's desires and their mutual satisfaction, they had nothing to say, and both knew it. "Do you know, he doesn't know Anna," remarked Oblonsky, "and I want to introduce him to her. Come on, Levin." "Is it possible?" said Vronsky. "She will be very much pleased. I should beg you to come at once. But I am troubled about Yashvin, and I want to stay here till he has finished playing." "Is he going to lose?" "All he has. I'm the only one who has any influence over him," said Vronsky. "What do you say, Levin? Shall we have a game of pool? First rate," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Place the pyramid," he said, addressing the marker. "It is all ready," replied the marker, who had some time before put the balls in the triangular frame and had placed the red ball in readiness to break the pyramid. "Well then, go ahead." After their game, Vronsky and Levin sat down at Gagin's table, and Levin, at Stepan Arkadyevitch's instance, began to bet on the aces. Vronsky sat down for a time at the same table, where his acquaintances kept coming up and joining him. Then, after a time, he went to the infernal Naya to find out how Yashvin was getting along. Levin felt a pleasant sense of exhilaration after the intellectual weariness of the morning. He was pleased to have his unfriendly feelings toward Vronsky ended, and the impression of restfulness, good fellowship, and comfort still remained by him. When the game was ended, Stepan Arkadyevitch took Levin's arm, saying, "Well, let us go see Anna. We needn't wait for Vronsky. What say you? She is at home. I promised her to bring you a long time ago. Where were you going this evening?"
"Nowhere in particular. I only told Sviazhsky I would go to the Society of Rural Economy. But I'll go with you, if you wish."
"Excellent. Let's go then. See if my carriage has come," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, addressing a lackey. Levin went to the desk, paid the 40 rubles which he had lost at cards, in some mysterious way gave his fee to the old lackey who was standing by the door, and went through the long rooms down to the entrance. Chapter 9. Part 7, Chapter 9 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. "Oblonsky's carriage!" cried the Swiss in a portentous voice. The carriage came up and the two friends got in. Only as long as the carriage was still in the courtyard did Levin continue to experience the feeling of clubbish comfort, of satisfaction, and of indubitable decorum which had surrounded him. But as soon as the carriage rolled out on the street, the jolting over the uneven pavement, the cries of an angry isvostchik whom they met, and the sight of the red sign of a low public-house and some shops lighted up, caused this impression to fade away, and he began to think over what follies he had committed, and to ask himself if he were doing right in going to see Anna. What would Kitty say? Stepan Arkadyevitch, as if he had divined what was passing in the mind of his companion, cut short his meditations. "How glad I am," said he, "that you are going to know her. Do you know Dolly has been wishing it for a long time. Lvov goes to her house, too. Though she is my sister," continued Stepan Arkadyevitch, "I am bold enough to say that she is a remarkable woman. You will see it. Her position is very hard, especially just now."
"Why do you say especially now?"
"We are negotiating with her husband for a divorce, and he is willing, but there are difficulties on account of the son, and this matter, which ought to have been settled long ago, is dragging on now these 3 months. As soon as the divorce is granted, she will marry Vronsky. How stupid it is, this old habit of dizziness, Isaiah rejoice, in which no one believes, and which destroys the happiness of people," exclaimed Stepan Arkadyevitch, interrupting what he was saying. Then he went on, "And then her position will become as regular as yours or mine."
"Where does the difficulty lie?"
"Ugh, it is a long and tiresome story. Everything is so undecided. But this is the point. She has been waiting 3 months for that divorce here in Moscow, where everybody knows her and him, and she doesn't see a single woman but Dolly, because, don't you see, she doesn't wish that any one should come to see her from pity. What do you think? That fool of a Princess Varvara left her because she considered it irregular. Any other woman than Anna would not have found resources in herself. But you shall see how she lives, how dignified and calm she is. To the left, at the corner opposite the church," cried Oblonsky to the coachman, leaning out of the window. "Phew, how hot it is!" he added, throwing open his shuba in spite of 12 degrees of cold.
"Well, she has a daughter, hasn't she, to take up her time and attention?"
"You seem to imagine every woman to be only a setting hen, une couveuse," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Why, yes, of course, she gives her time and attention to her daughter, but she doesn't make any fuss about it. She's occupied mainly with her writing. I see you smile ironically, but you are wrong. She has written a book for young people. She hasn't spoken of it to any one except me, and I showed the manuscript to Vorkoyev, the publisher. You know, he is a writer himself, it seems. He is up in such matters, and he says that it is a remarkable thing. Do you think that she sets up for a blue stocking? Not at all. Anna is, above all things, a woman with a heart, as you will see. She has in her house a little English girl and a whole family, and is looking after them."
"What? Some philanthropical scheme?"
"Here you are immediately trying to turn it into something absurd. It is not for philanthropy's sake, but because she loves to do it. They had, that is, Vronsky had, an English trainer, a master in his calling, but a drunkard. He did nothing but drink, delirium tremens, and abandoned his family. Anna saw them, helped them,
got drawn in more and more, and now has the whole family on her hands. I don't mean merely by giving them money. She herself teaches the boys Russian, so as to fit them for the gymnasium, and she has taken the little girl home with her. Well, you shall see her." At this moment the carriage entered a courtyard. Stepan Arkadyevitch rang at the door before which they stopped, and, without inquiring whether the mistress of the house was at home, went into the vestibule. Levin followed him, more and more uneasy as to the propriety of the step he was taking. He saw, as he looked at himself in the glass, that he was very red in the face, but he knew that this was not tipsy. He went upon the carpeted stairs after Oblonsky. On the second floor a servant received them with a bow, and Stepan Arkadyevitch, as if he were a connection, asked him, "Who is with Anna Arkadyevna?" and received the answer, "Mr. Vorkoyev." "Where are they?" "In the library." They passed through a small, wainscoted dining room, and walking along on the thick carpet they came to the library, dimly lighted by a single lamp with a huge shade. A reflector lamp on the wall threw its full rays on a full-length portrait of a woman, which instantly attracted Levin's attention. While Stepan Arkadyevitch went on, and the man's voice, which had been heard, ceased speaking, Levin stood looking at the portrait which shone down from its frame, and he could not tear himself away. He forgot where he was, and, not hearing what was said, he kept his eyes fixed on the wonderful portrait. It was not a painting, but a living, beautiful woman, with her dark, curling hair, bare shoulders and arms, and a pensive half-smile on her lovely lips, and gazing at him triumphantly and yet tenderly from her entrancing eyes. Only because it was not alive did it not seem more beautiful than life itself. "Ya очень rada. I am very glad," a voice said suddenly behind him, evidently addressed to him, the voice of the same woman whom he admired in the picture. It was Anna, who had been concealed by a lattice-work of climbing plants, and who rose to receive her visitor. And in the dark of the library Levin recognized the original of the portrait, in a simple dark blue gown, not in the same position, not with the same expression, but with the same lofty beauty which had been represented by the artist in the painting. She was less brilliant in the reality, but the living woman had a new attraction which the portrait lacked. End of chapter 9. Part 7, Chapter 10 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. She advanced to meet him, and did not conceal the pleasure which his visit caused her. With the ease and simplicity which Levin recognized as characteristic of a woman of the best society, she extended to him a small, energetic hand, introduced him to Vorkoyev, and called his attention to a light-complexioned and pretty little girl, her pupil, she said, who was seated with her work near the table. "I am very, very glad," she repeated, and in these simple words, spoken by her, Levin found an extraordinary significance. "I have known you and liked you for ever so long, both because of your friendship with Stiva and because of your wife. I knew her a very short time, but she gave me the impression of a flower, a lovely flower, and to think, she will soon be a mother." She talked freely and without haste, occasionally looking from Levin to her brother, and Levin was conscious that the impression which he had produced was excellent, and he immediately felt perfectly at his ease with her and on the simplest and most friendly terms, as if he had known her from childhood. To Oblonsky, who asked if smoking was allowed, she replied, "That is why we have taken refuge in Alexei's study," and, looking at Levin, instead of asking, "Do you smoke?" she held over a tortoise-shell cigar-case to him, and took a cigarette herself. "How are you today?" asked her brother. "Pretty well. A little nervous, as usual." "Isn't it extraordinarily good?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, noticing Levin's admiration of the portrait. "I never saw a better portrait." "An extraordinary likeness, isn't it?" added Vorkoyev. Levin looked from the portrait to the original. Anna's face lighted up with a peculiar glow as she felt conscious of his eyes resting on her. He blushed, and, to conceal his confusion, was just going to ask her when she had seen Darya Alexandrovna, but at that instant Anna said, "Ivan Petrovitch and I were talking just now of Vestchenkov's pictures. Do you know them?" "Yes, I have seen them," answered Levin. "But I beg your pardon, you were just going to ask me something?" Levin asked whether she had seen Dolly lately. "She was here yesterday. She was indignant at what happened to Grisha at the gymnasium. It seems his Latin teacher was unfair to him." "Yes, I saw the pictures. They pleased me very much," said Levin, returning to the topic which they had begun to talk about. What Levin now said was entirely free from the technical formality with which he had talked in the morning. Every word of the conversation with her seemed to be significant, and pleasant as it was to talk with her, it was still pleasanter to listen to her. Anna talked not only naturally and intelligently, but, though intelligently, still without pretense, not arrogating any great importance to her own thoughts, but attributing great importance to what her friends said. The conversation turned on the new tendencies of art and on some of the illustrations to the Bible which a French artist had recently made. Vorkoyev severely criticized the realism which the artist carried to brutality. Levin remarked that the French had carried conventionality in art to greater lengths than any other people, and that, therefore, they found a special merit in the reaction toward realism. They discovered poetry in the fact that they no longer lied. Never had Levin said a clever thing which gave him anything like the pleasure that this did. Anna's face grew suddenly bright as the full force of his remark dawned on her. She laughed. "I am delighted," she said, "just as you are when you see a very lifelike portrait. What you said is characteristic of all French art at the present time, painting and even literature, Zola, Daudet. But possibly this is always the way that men form their conceptions from imagery, conventional figures. But afterwards, all the combinaisons made, the imaginary figures weary, and people begin to invent more natural and truthful figures." "That is perfectly true," said Vorkoyev. "Have you been to the club?" asked Anna, turning to her brother. Yes, here is a genuine woman," said Levin to himself, forgetting himself and gazing steadily into her handsome, mobile face, which now suddenly changed its expression. Levin did not hear what she was talking about as she bent over toward her brother, but he was struck by the change in her expression. Beautiful as it had been before in repose, it now suddenly assumed a mixed expression of curiosity, wrath, and pride. But this lasted only for 1 minute. She half closed her eyes, as if she were trying to remember something. "However, this is interesting to no one," said she, and she addressed the English girl in English. "Please order the tea in the drawing-room." The girl rose and went out. "Well, has she passed the examination?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Perfectly. She is a very capable girl and a lovely character." "You will end by loving her better than your own daughter." "That is just like a man. In love there is no such a thing as more or less. I love my daughter in one way, and this girl in another." "I tell Anna Arkadyevna," said Vorkoyev, "that if she would spend 100th part of the activity she devotes to this little English girl for the benefit of Russian children, what a service her energy would render. She would accomplish prodigies." "Now there, what you want I can't do. Count Alexey Kirillovitch," she glanced with an air of timid inquiry at Levin as she pronounced this name, and he involuntarily responded by a look which was encouraging and full of admiration, "used to encourage me, when we were in the country, to visit the schools. I went a few times. They were very pleasant, but I couldn't get interested in this occupation. You talk of energy, but the foundation of energy is love, and love does not come at will. So I love this little English girl, but I really don't know why." She looked at Levin again, and her smile and her look all told him that she spoke only with the aim of gaining his approval, though sure in advance that they understood each other. "I agree with you thoroughly," cried he. "You can't put your heart into schools and such things. And I think that from the same reason philanthropic institutions generally give such small results." She was silent for a moment, then she smiled. Yes, she replied. "I never could. Je n'ai pas le cœur assez large to love a whole asylum of wretched little girls. Qu'elle ne m'a jamais réussi. Women do it only to win for themselves position sociale. Even now, when I have so much need of occupation," she added, with a sad, confiding expression, addressing Levin, though she was speaking to her brother, "even now I cannot." Then suddenly frowning, and Levin saw that she frowned because she had begun to speak of herself, she changed the subject. "I know about you," she said, smiling at Levin. "You have the reputation of being only an indifferent citizen, but I have always defended you as well as I could." "How have you defended me?" "That depends on the attacks. But suppose we have some tea," said she. She rose and took a morocco-bound book which was lying on the table. "Give it to me, Anna Arkadyevna," said Vorkoyev, pointing to the book. "It is well worth while." "No, it is all so unfinished." "I have told him about it," remarked Stepan Arkadyevitch, indicating Levin. "You were wrong. My writings are like those little baskets and carvings made by prisoners, which Liza Myertsalova used to sell. She managed the prisons for our society," said she, turning to Levin. "Those unfortunates used to do perfect miracles of patience." Levin was struck by still a new feature in this remarkable, fascinating woman. Besides wit, grace, beauty, she had sincerity. She did not wish to conceal the thorns of her situation. As she said that she sighed, and her face suddenly assumed a stern expression, as if it were changed to stone. With this expression on her face she was even more beautiful than before. But that expression was new. It was entirely alien to that which a few minutes before had seemed to irradiate happiness, and which the artist had managed to reproduce in the portrait. Levin looked once more at the portrait and at the original of it, while Anna took her brother's arm, and a feeling of tenderness and pity came over him, surprising even himself. She let the two gentlemen pass into the parlor, and remained behind to speak to Stiva. "What is she talking with him about? The divorce? Vronsky? What he was doing at the club? About me?" thought Levin, and he was so stirred that he heard nothing that Vorkoyev was saying to him about the merits of the story for children which Anna Arkadyevna had written. During tea, a pleasant conversation full of ideas was carried on. There seemed to be no lack of subjects at any moment, but it was felt that there was time to say all that anyone wanted to say, and each was willing to listen when the other talked. And all that was said, not only by Anna herself, but by Vorkoyev and by Stepan Arkadyevitch, had a special significance, thanks to her interested attention and her pertinent remarks. So at least it seemed to Levin. All the time they were talking, Levin studied her, and admired her beauty and the cultivation of her mind, and not less her perfect simplicity and naturalness. He listened and talked, and all the time thought about her and her inner life, and tried to penetrate her feelings, and he, who had formerly criticized her so severely, now by some strange train of thought justified her and pitied her, and confessed to himself the fear that Vronsky did not wholly understand her. It was more than 11 o'clock when Stepan Arkadyevitch rose to go. Vorkoyev had already left some time before. Levin rose, too, but with regret. He felt as if he had only just come. "Прощайте, farewell," said Anna to him, holding his hand in hers, and looking into his eyes with a fascinating look. "I am glad que la glace est rompue." She let go his hand and her eyes twinkled. "Tell your wife that I love her as I have always done, and, if she cannot forgive me my position, tell her how I hope she may never pardon me, for to pardon it is necessary to understand what I have suffered, and God preserve her from that." "Yes, I will surely tell her," answered Levin, and the color came into his face. Chapter 10. Part 7, Chapter 11 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. "What a wonderful, lovely, and pitiable woman," thought Levin, as he went out with Stepan Arkadyevitch into the cold night air. "There, what did I tell you?" demanded Oblonsky, as he saw that Levin was perfectly overcome. "Wasn't I right?" "Yes," answered Levin thoughtfully. "An extraordinary woman. Not only intellectual, but she has a wonderfully warm heart. What a terrible pity it is about her. Now, thank God, all will soon be arranged, I hope. Well, after this, don't form hasty judgments," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, opening his carriage door. "Prощай, farewell, we go different ways." Levin went home, never ceasing to think about Anna, recalling the smallest incidents of the evening, bringing back all the charm of her face, and understanding her situation better and better, and, at the same time, feeling the deepest commiseration for her. When he reached his house, Kuzma told Levin that Katerina Alexandrovna was well, and that her sisters had but just left her. He handed him at the same time 2 letters. Levin, as he stood in the vestibule, ran through them at once so as not to be distracted afterward. One was from his superintendent, Sokolov. Sokolov wrote that he had not found a purchaser who would give more than 5.5 rubles for the wheat, and that he could not raise money elsewhere. The other letter was from his sister. She reproached him because her affairs were not yet regulated. "Well, we'll sell for 5.5 rubles if they won't give more," thought he, settling with extraordinary promptness the first question which had been troubling him. "It is wonderful how the time here is occupied," he said to himself, thinking of the second letter. He felt that he was to blame toward his sister because he had not yet accomplished what she had asked him to do for her. "Today I did not get to court either, but I did not have a moment's time." And, making up his mind that he would surely go the next day, he went to his wife's room. On his way, he cast a quick glance back at his day. There had been nothing except conversations in which he had listened and in which he had taken part. Not one of the subjects touched on what would have occupied him when in the country, but here they were very interesting, and all the conversations in which he had engaged were good, only in 2 places were they not absolutely good. One was his remark about the fish at the club, the other was something intangibly wrong in his feelings of tender pity for Anna. Levin found his wife sad and absent-minded. The dinner of the 3 sisters had been merry, but afterward they had waited and waited for him, and the evening had seemed long to them, and now Kitty was alone. "Well, what have you been doing?" she asked him, looking at him, as she did so, with a suspicious light in her eyes. But she took good care to conceal her intentions, so as not to prevent him from telling her the whole story, and with an encouraging smile she listened as he told her how he had spent the evening. "Well, I met Vronsky at the club, and I am very glad of it. I felt very much at my ease with him, and enjoyed it. Of course, I shall try to avoid him, but still henceforth I shan't feel that awkwardness in his society." As he said these words he remembered that in order not to avoid him, he had immediately gone to Anna's house, and his face grew red. "Here we say the peasantry drink, but I don't know which drink more, the peasantry or men in society. The peasantry drink on festival days, but—" Kitty was not interested in the question of how much the peasantry drank. She saw her husband's face glow red, and she wanted to know the reason. "Well, where else did you go?" "Stiva insisted on my going with him to Anna Arkadyevna's," answered he, blushing more and more, and his doubts as to the propriety of his visit to Anna were decided for him. He now knew that he ought not to have done so. Kitty's eyes opened wide and flashed at the mention of Anna, but she restrained herself, and, concealing her emotion, she misled him. She merely said, "Ah." "You are not going to be vexed with me because I went? Stiva begged me to go, and Dolly wanted me to." "Oh, no," said she, but in her eyes he saw a look which boded little good. "She is a very charming woman, who is very much to be pitied. A good woman," continued Levin, and he described the life which Anna led, and gave her message of remembrance to Kitty. "Yes, of course she is to be pitied," said Kitty when he had finished. "Whom did you get a letter from?" He told her, and, misled by her apparent calmness, went to undress. When he came back he found Kitty in the same armchair. When he approached, she looked at him and burst into tears. "What is it? What's the matter?" he asked with some annoyance, for he understood the cause of her tears. "You are in love with that horrid woman. She's bewitched you. I saw it in your eyes. Yes, yes. What will be the end of it? You were at the club. You drank too much. You gambled, and then you went. Where? No, this shall not go on. We must leave. I am going home to-morrow." It was long before Levin could pacify his wife, and when at last he succeeded, it was only by acknowledging that his feeling of pity for Anna, together with the wine, had clouded his brain, and that he had fallen under her seductive influence, and by promising that he would avoid her. What he acknowledged with more sincerity was the ill effect produced on him by this idle life in Moscow, passed in eating, drinking, and gossiping. They talked till 3 o'clock in the morning. Only when it was 3 o'clock were they sufficiently reconciled to go to sleep. End of chapter 11. Part 7, Chapter 12 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. After having said good-bye to her visitors, without sitting down, Anna began to walk up and down the full length of her apartments. Of late she had got into the habit of unconsciously doing all she could to attract young men to her, and so this whole evening she had striven to awaken a feeling of love in Levin. But though she knew that she had succeeded in doing this as far as it was possible with a chaste married man, and though he pleased her very much, and in spite of the sharply defined dissimilarities between Vronsky and Levin, she as a woman was able to detect the subtle likeness between them, which had caused Kitty to be in love with them both. Yet as soon as he had left the room she ceased to think about him. One thought, and one only in various guises, followed her. Why, since I have so evidently an attraction for others, for this married man who is in love with his wife, why is he so cold to me? Yet not exactly cold. He loves me, I know. But lately something new has come between us. Why has he spent the whole evening away? He told Stiva that he could not leave Yashvin, but had to watch him while he played. Is Yashvin a baby? It must be true. He never tells lies. But there is something else back of it. He is glad of the chance to show me that he has other duties. I know this. I don't object to it, but what need has he to assert it so? He wants to show that his love for me must not interfere with his independence. But the proof is not necessary. I must have his love. He ought to understand the wretchedness of the life I lead here in Moscow. Why am I living? I am not living, only dragging out life, in hope of a turn in affairs, which never, never comes. And Stiva says that he can't go to Alexey Alexandrovitch. And I can't write again. I cannot do anything. I can't begin anything. Or make any changes, but only control myself, wait and invent amusements. This English family, my reading, my writing. But it is all only to deceive myself, like this morphine. He ought to be sorry for me, she said, feeling how the tears of pity at her own lot filled her eyes. She heard the doorbell Vronsky rang violently, and instantly she wiped away her tears. Not only wiped away the tears, but sat down near the lamp with a book, and pretended to be calm. She felt that she must show her dissatisfaction because he had not returned as he had promised, but not to let her grief be seen. She might pity herself, but Vronsky must not be allowed to pity her. She did not want a contest. She blamed him because he wanted to quarrel, but she herself involuntarily took the attitude of an opponent. "Well, you weren't lonely, were you?" said he, briskly and cheerfully, as he came toward her. "What a terrible passion gambling is!" "No, I was not lonely. I long ago learned not to be lonely. Stiva and Levin have been here to see me." "Yes, I knew that they intended to come. Well, and how do you like Levin?" he asked, as he sat down near her. "Very much. They have only just gone. How about Yashvin?" "He had won 17,000 rubles. I got him away, but he escaped from me and went back again. And now he's losing." "But why did you abandon him?" said Anna, suddenly raising her eyes to his. The expression of her face was cold and unpleasant. "You told Stiva that you were going to stay, to bring him away. And now you abandon him?" "In the first place, I did not send any message to you. In the second place, I never tell lies. and chiefly I wished to stay, and I stayed," he answered angrily. "Anna, why do you do so?" added he, after a moment's silence, holding out his hand to her in the hope that she would place hers in it. She was glad of this appeal to her love, but some strange spirit of evil prevented her from yielding. "Of course you stayed because you wanted to. You always do as you please. But why tell me so? What is the good?" answered she, growing more and more heated. "Who denies that you tell the truth? You wish to justify yourself. Do so then." Vronsky drew back his hand, and his face became more set than before. "For you, this is a matter of obstinacy," she cried, looking at him fixedly, and suddenly finding the term by which to call the expression of his face, which exasperated her. "Sheer obstinacy. For you, the question is to see whether you will win the victory over me. But the question for me—" and again the sense of her pitiable lot came over her, and she almost sobbed. "If you knew what it meant for me when I feel, as I do now, that you hate me. Yes, hate me. If you knew what it meant for me. If you knew how near I am to horrible misfortune at these moments. How I fear for myself." And she turned away to hide her sobs. "But what's all this for?" said Vronsky, alarmed at this despair, and leaning toward Anna to take her hand and kiss it. "Do I seek outside diversion? Don't I avoid the society of women?" "As if that were all," said she. "Well, tell me what I must do to make you content. I am ready to do anything that you may be happy," said he, moved to see her in such despair. "What would I not do to spare you such grief, Anna?" he said. "It's nothing, she replied. "I myself don't know. It's the loneliness. It's my nerves. There, let's not talk about it any more. Tell me what happened at the races. Why haven't you told me about it?" she asked, attempting to conceal the pride she felt at her victory, for she knew it rested with her. Vronsky asked for some supper, and as he was eating described to her the incidents of the races. But from the sound of his voice and from his glance that grew colder and colder, she saw that he would not forgive her for the victory, that the sense of obstinacy which she had struggled to overcome was as firm in him as ever. He was colder toward her than before, as if he regretted having yielded to her. And as she remembered the words that won her the victory, especially the words, "How near I am to horrible misfortune, and I fear for myself," she realized that it was a dangerous weapon, and that she must never employ it again. But she felt that along with the love which united them, there stood between them an evil spirit of conflict, which she had not the power to drive from his heart, and still less from her own. Chapter 12. Part 7, Chapter 13 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. There are no imaginable conditions to which a man cannot accustom himself, especially if he sees that all those who surround him are living in the same way. 3 months before, Levin would not have believed that he could have slept tranquilly under the conditions in which he found himself at the present time. That living an aimless, unprofitable life, spending more than his income, getting tipsy, for he could not call his experience at the club anything else, his absurd intimacy with a man with whom his wife had once been in love, and his still more absurd visit to a woman whom it was impossible to regard as respectable, and after the fascination which she had exerted over him and the mortification which he had caused his wife, that under all these conditions he could sleep serenely. But under the influence of his weariness, the long hours without a nap, and the wine which he had drunk, he slept soundly and serenely. At 5 o'clock the noise of an opening door wakened him. He sat up and looked around. Kitty was not in bed next to him, but behind the screen there was a light moving, and he heard her steps. "What's the matter?" he asked, still only half awake. "Kitty? What is it?" "Nothing. answered she, coming from behind the screen with a candle in her hand and smiling at him with a peculiarly sweet and significant smile. "I don't feel quite well." "What? Is this the beginning? Must we send?" he exclaimed in alarm, and he began to dress as quickly as possible. "No, no," said she, smiling and holding his hand. "It's nothing. I did not feel quite well. It's all right now." Going back to bed, she put out the light and lay down again, keeping perfectly still, although her very stillness and the way she, as it were, held her breath, were suspicious, and still more so the expression of peculiar tenderness and alertness with which, as she came out from behind the screen, she said to him, "It's nothing." Still, he was so overcome by drowsiness that he immediately went to sleep again. It was only afterward that he realized the calmness of her spirit, and appreciated all that was passing in her dear, gentle heart as she lay thus motionless near him, awaiting the most solemn moment of a woman's life. About 7 o'clock he was awakened by her hand touching his shoulder and her low whisper. She apparently hesitated between the fear of waking him and the wish to speak to him. "Kostya, don't be afraid. It's nothing. But I think Lizaveta Petrovna had better be called." The candle was again lighted. She was sitting on the bed, holding the knitting on which she had been at work during the last few days. "Please don't be alarmed. I'm not in the least afraid," said she, seeing her husband's terrified face, and she pressed his hand to her breast, then to her lips. Levin leapt from the bed and, unconscious of himself, without taking his eyes off his wife for a moment, hurried on his dressing gown. It was necessary for him to go, but he could not tear himself away. Dearly as he loved her face, as well as he knew her expression, her eyes, yet never before had he seen her look as she did then. How ugly and horrible did he now seem as he saw her now, and remembered the mortification which he had caused her the evening before. Her flushed face, with the clustering soft curls escaping from under her nightcap, was radiant with joy and resolution. Natural and simple as Kitty's character in general was, Levin was amazed by what unfolded itself before him now, when suddenly all the curtains were withdrawn, and the very essence of her soul shone in her eyes. And in this simplicity and revelation, she, her very self, whom he loved, was more apparent than ever. She looked at him and smiled, but suddenly her brows contracted. She lifted her head and, coming to him, took his hand and clung to him, sighing painfully. She suffered, and yet she seemed to pity him for her sufferings. At first, as he saw this silent suffering, it seemed to him that he was to blame for it. But in her look there was tenderness which told him that she not only did not blame him, but that she loved him all the more for her suffering. "If not I, who, then, is to blame for this?" he asked himself. She suffered, and she seemed to take pride in her pain and to rejoice in it. He saw that in her soul some beautiful transformation was taking place. But what? He could not understand. It was above his comprehension. "I have sent for mamma. Now go quickly and get Lizaveta Petrovna." "Kostya, it's nothing. It's all over." She went to the other side of the room and rang the bell. "There, now, please go. Pasha is coming. I want nothing." And Levin, with astonishment, saw her take up her work again. As he went out of one door, he heard Pasha, the maid, come in at the other. He paused on the threshold and listened as Kitty gave directions for arranging the room, and as she herself began to move the bed. He dressed, and when he had ordered his carriage, since it was too early for isvostchiks, he flew up to her room again, not on tiptoes, but on wings, as it seemed to him. 2 maids were busily engaged in moving something in the room. Kitty was walking up and down, knitting swiftly, slipping the knots, and giving directions. "I'm going for the doctor immediately. Lizaveta Petrovna has been sent for, but I will call there. There is nothing more, is there? Oh, yes, Dolly." She looked at him, evidently without hearing what he said. "Yes, yes, go," said she, and motioned to him with her hand. He was just passing through the drawing-room when he heard a groan, pitiful but instantly suppressed. He stood still and could not make up his mind. It is she, he said to himself, and putting his hands to his head, he rushed out. Lord have mercy on us, pardon us, save us, he exclaimed, and these words, which suddenly and unexpectedly came to his lips, were not spoken merely by his lips, unbeliever though he was. Now at this instant he knew perfectly well that all his doubts and the impossibility which his reason found in belief had not the slightest influence to prevent him from addressing himself to God. Everything of this sort now vanished like dust from his soul. To whom could he address himself, if not to Him in whose hands he felt were held himself, and his soul, and his love? The horse was not yet ready, but, feeling the special strain of physical powers unemployed, and of the work before him calling for his attention, he started on foot, so as not to lose a single instant, and ordered Kuzma to follow him. At the corner of the street he met a knight isvostchik hurrying along. In the little sledge sat Lizaveta Petrovna, in velvet cloak, with her head wrapped up in a kerchief. "Thank God," he murmured, as he saw with joy her pale little face, which had a peculiarly serious, and even stern, expression. Not ordering the driver to stop, he ran along with it back to the house. "Only 2 hours? Not more?" asked Lizaveta Petrovna. "You may speak to Pyotr Dmitrich, but don't hurry him. Yes, please get some opium at the apothecary's." "Do you think all will go on well?" asked he. "God help us," he added, as he saw his horse starting from the door. He got into the sledge alongside of Kuzma and ordered him to hurry to the doctor's. Chapter 13. Part 7, Chapter 14 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Marianne Spiegel. The doctor was not yet up, and a servant, who was busy cleaning the lamps, announced that his master had gone to bed late, and had given orders not to be waked, but would be up before long. The lackey was polishing lamp chimneys, and seemed very much absorbed in this occupation. At first this absorption of the lackey in his lamp chimneys, and his indifference to what was going on at home, made Levin indignant. But on reflection he realized that no one knew anything about it, or was obliged to share in his feelings, and that consequently it was incumbent on him to be calm, reasonable, and firm, so as to break down that wall of indifference, and attain his end. "I must not spoil matters by haste," said Levin to himself, feeling all the time a growing intensity of physical energy and concentration on what was before him. Now that he knew that the doctor was not up, and had given orders not to be disturbed, Levin thought over several plans which presented themselves to him, and finally decided on the following: to send Kuzma with a note to another doctor, to go himself to the apothecary's for the laudanum, and, if on his return the doctor was not up, then either by bribery or by main force, if the man would not consent, to waken the doctor at any cost. At the apothecary's the lean clerk, with the same indifference as the lackey cleaning the lamp chimneys had shown, put a seal on the powders for the waiting coachman, and refused to deliver the opium. Striving not to get impatient or angry, and mentioning the doctor and the midwife by name, and telling what it was needed for, Levin pleaded with him. The clerk asked his employer in German if it should be permitted, and, receiving a favorable reply from behind the screen, he proceeded to get out the bottle and a funnel, and slowly poured the liquid from it into a smaller vial, pasted it on a label, sealed it, and, in spite of Levin's urgency not to do so, was even going to wrap it up. This Levin could not endure. He resolutely snatched the vial out of the clerk's hands, and rushed through the great glass doors. The doctor was still asleep, and, this time, the servant was shaking the rugs. Levin, leisurely getting from his pocket a 10-ruble note, and dwelling on his words, but not wasting time, gave him the money, and explained that Pyotr Dmitrievitch, how great and significant now seemed this hitherto unimportant Pyotr Dmitrievitch, had promised him to be on hand at any time, so that he would certainly not be angry, and that, therefore, he must instantly awaken him. The lackey consented, and went upstairs, and showed Levin into the reception room. Levin could hear in the next room how the doctor coughed, walked about, washed his face and hands, and made some remarks. 3 minutes passed. It seemed to Levin that it was more than an hour. He could no longer contain himself.
Pyotr Dmitrievitch!
Pyotr Dmitrievitch! He cried through the opened door in a beseeching voice.
For God's sake, forgive me. Let me come in just as you are. It's been more than 2 hours now.
I'll be out immediately, replied a voice, and Levin to his surprise knew by the sound of the doctor's voice that he was smiling as he spoke.
Just for 1 little minute.
I'll be out immediately. 2 minutes more went by while the doctor was putting on his boots, and another 2 minutes while he was brushing his hair and putting on his coat.
Pyotr Dmitrievitch,
Levin was saying once more, but at that instant the doctor came in, all ready dressed and with his hair brushed.
These people have no hearts, thought Levin. He can brush his hair while we are dying.
Good morning, said the doctor, entering the reception room serenely and offering to shake hands. Don't feel anxious. Well, how is it? Levin began at once a long and circumstantial account, filled with a crowd of useless details, and interrupted himself at every moment to urge the doctor to set out. Yes, but you must not be anxious. You see, you don't know. I'm really not in need yet. Still, I have promised, and I assure you I'll go. But there's no hurry. Please sit down. Won't you have some coffee? Levin looked at him with a questioning look, asking with his eyes if he were not laughing at him, but the doctor was in serious earnest. I know, added the physician, smiling. I myself am a family man, and we husbands cut a sorry figure in such cases. The husband of one of my patients always, on such occasion, goes off to the stable.
But do you think, Pyotr Dmitrievitch, do you think she'll get on well?
All the indications point to a fortunate issue.
Won't you come at once? Said Levin, looking with angry eyes at the servant who was bringing in the coffee.
Within an hour.
For God's sake!
Well, let me take my coffee. The doctor proceeded to take his breakfast. Both were silent. It seems the Turks are beating. Did you read the telegram last evening? Asked the doctor, biting into a roll.
No, but I'm going, said Levin. Will you come in a quarter of an hour?
Make it a half.
On your honor.
When Levin got home he found the princess at the door, and they went to Kitty's room together. The princess had tears in her eyes, and her hands trembled. When she saw Levin she threw her arms round him and kissed him. How is it, Lizaveta Petrovna? Dearie, said she, seizing the midwife's hand as she came to meet them with a radiant but solicitous face. It is going well, said she. It would be well for her to lie down. Try to persuade her. She would find it easier. Ever since Levin, on waking, had understood the situation, he had made up his mind, without indulging in anxious thought or forebodings, crushing down all his anxieties and feelings, firmly, without worrying his wife, but, on the contrary, calming her and sustaining her courage, that he would endure what was before him. Not allowing himself even to think of what was coming or how it might end, judging by answers to his questions how long it generally lasted, Levin, in his imagination, prepared to have patience and hold his heart in his hands for 5 hours, and this seemed to him within the limit of possibility. But when he returned after his visit to the doctor's and found Kitty still suffering, again he cried more and more frequently, "Lord, forgive us, and be merciful." And he was afraid that he could not endure it, so terrible was it to him. Thus an hour went by. And after this another hour passed, and a second, and a third, and the 5 which he had set as the very ultimate limit of his endurance. And the situation was still the same, and still he was enduring the suspense, because there was nothing else to do except endure, thinking every moment that he had reached the last limit, and that his heart would burst with his agony. But the minutes still went by, hours and hours, and his feelings of agony and horror kept growing worse and more unendurable. All the ordinary conditions of life, without which it is impossible to take cognizance of anything, ceased to exist for Levin. He lost all consciousness of time. Now the minutes when she called him to her, and he held her moist hand, which at one time would press his with extraordinary force, and again push him away, seemed hours. Then again the hours would seem to him minutes. He He was surprised when Lizaveta Petrovna asked for a light, and he learned that it was 5 o'clock in the evening. If they had told him that it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, he would have been just as much surprised. Where the time had gone, what he had done, where he had been, he could not have told. Sometimes he saw Kitty's flushed face, now troubled and piteous, then calm and almost smiling, as she tried to reassure him. Then he saw the princess, flushed with anxiety, her grey curls in disorder, swallowing down her tears and biting her lips to keep from crying. He had also seen Dolly, and the doctor smoking great cigarettes, and Lizaveta Petrovna, with a calm, serious, but reassuring look, and the old prince, pacing the dining room with a frowning face. But how they came and went, and where they had been, he could not tell. The princess had been with the doctor in Kitty's room, then in the library where a well-set table had appeared, then she disappeared, and Dolly was in her place. Then Levin remembered that they sent him somewhere. He moved a divan and a table zealously, thinking it was for her sake, and only when it was done did he learn that they were preparing his own bed for the night. He was sent to the library to ask the doctor something. The doctor replied, and then began to speak of the disorders of the Duma, or town council. Then they sent him to the princess's bedchamber to get a holy image made of silver, with a gold trimming, from there, and, with the aid of an old chambermaid of the princess's, he climbed up to get it from the cabinet, and, in doing so, broke a little lamp, and the old woman consoled him for this accident, and encouraged him about his wife. And he had carried the image to Kitty, and placed it at her head, carefully arranging it behind her pillow. But where, when, and why all this was done, was more than he could tell. Neither did he comprehend why the old princess took him by the hand and, looking at him compassionately, begged him to calm himself, or why Dolly tried to persuade him to eat something, and led him from the room, or why even the doctor looked at him gravely and sympathetically, and offered him a pill. He knew and felt conscious only that what was occurring was like that which had occurred the year before at the hotel of the government city, by the deathbed of his brother Nikolai. That was grief, this was happiness. But that grief and this happiness were in the same way outside of the ordinary conditions of life, were in this peculiar life, as it were, the loopholes through which appeared something higher, and in exactly the same way, while the hard, painful event was accomplishing before him, in exactly the same way incomprehensible, his soul, at the contemplation of this loftiness, raised itself to a height which he had never before dreamed possible, and whither his reason could not follow. "Lord, have mercy and aid us," he kept repeating, in spite of his long lack of practice, and yet feeling that he was addressing God with the same simplicity, the same confidence, as in his childhood and early youth. All this time he seemed to be leading two separate existences. One was away from Kitty, with the doctor smoking one fat cigarette after another, and knocking the ashes off against the rim of the unemptied ash-tray, or with Dolly and the old princess, who insisted on talking about dinner, politics, or the illness of Marya Petrovna, and with whom Levin suddenly, for an instant, would forget entirely what was taking place, and feel wide awake. And the other was in her presence, by her bedside, where his heart felt as if it would burst, and it almost did break with compassion, and where he did not cease to pray to God. And every time when he would be aroused from momentary oblivion by a cry coming from her chamber, he would fall under the same strange delusion as had at the first moment taken possession of him. Every time he heard the cry he would spring to his feet, hasten to her room, and on the way remember that he was not to blame, and would long to protect and help. And as he looked on her, he would see that there was no help to be given her, and again the pity would seize him, and he would pray, "Lord, forgive and help us." And in proportion as the time passed by, the stronger became the two conditions of mind. He would be calmer at one moment, perfectly oblivious of her, while remaining out of her presence, and then again the more painful would become his sympathetic torments and the feeling of helplessness before them. He would spring to his feet, feel the impulse to escape somewhere, and hasten to her. Sometimes when she would keep calling for him he would reproach her, but, seeing her submissive, smiling face, and hearing her words, I have tired you out," he would reproach God. But, remembering what God was, he would beg for pardon and aid. Chapter 14. Part 7, Chapter 15 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. He did not know whether it was late or early. The candles had already burned down. Dolly had just come into the library and was proposing to the doctor to lie down. Levin had been sitting there listening to the doctor's story of the charlatanry of magnetizers and looking at the ash at the end of his cigarette. It was one of the moments of rest, and he was oblivious. He had entirely forgotten what was taking place. He listened to the doctor and followed him understandingly. Suddenly he heard a cry unlike anything he had ever heard. The cry was so terrible that Levin did not even stir, but, holding his breath, he looked at the doctor with eyes full of questioning terror. The doctor bent his head, as if to hear better, and smiled with an air of approbation. Levin had reached the point where nothing could surprise him, and he said inwardly, "Evidently that must be so. But why that cry?" He went back to the sick room on tiptoe, passed round by Lizaveta Petrovna and the princess, and stood in his place by the bedside. The cry had ceased, but evidently there was some change. What he did not know, and did not care to know. But he saw it by the grave expression of Lizaveta Petrovna's pale face. Her face was stern and pale, and just as resolute as ever, although her lower jaw trembled a little. Her eyes were kept steadily fixed on Kitty. Her flushed, tortured face, with the little tufts of hair clinging to it, was turned toward him, and her eyes sought his. She raised her hand and tried to take his. When once she got hold of it, she tried with her moist hands to press it to her forehead. "Don't go, don't go. I'm not afraid," said she quickly. "Mamma, take away my earrings. They annoy me. You aren't afraid?" "Lizaveta Petrovna, quick, quick!" She spoke rapidly and tried to smile, but suddenly her face grew convulsed and she pushed him away. "This is terrible. I shall die. I shall die. Go, go!" Then came the same unearthly cry. Levin seized his head in his hands and rushed from the room. "That is nothing. All is going well," said Dolly, following after him. But, whatever they might say, he knew that now all was lost. Leaning his head against the lintel, he stood in the adjoining room, and listened to screams and moaning, such sounds as he had never heard before, and he knew that what was making such animal-like noise was she who had once been Kitty. He had long ceased to care about the child. He now hated that child. He went so far as to not wish for Kitty to live, provided only her horrible agonies might be ended. "Doctor, what does that mean? My God!" he said, seizing the doctor's arm as he went in. "It is the end," replied the doctor, and his face was so serious as he said this that Levin thought he meant that Kitty was dead. Not knowing what would become of him, he went back to the bedroom. What he first saw was Lizaveta Petrovna's face. It was even more than before pretentious and stern. It was no longer Kitty's face that was there. In the place where it had been before, there was something terrible both by reason of the agony which contracted it, and by reason of the sound that came from it. He bowed his head against the wooden frame of the bed, feeling that his heart would burst. The awful shriek still continued. It grew more piercing than ever, as if the last limit of horror had been reached. Then suddenly the shriek ceased. He could not believe it, but he could not doubt. And he heard a gentle rustling and a quick breathing, and his wife's living, loving, happy voice whispered, "Konechna, it's over." He raised his head. As she lay there, beautiful with a supernatural beauty, with her arms nervelessly resting on the counterpane, she looked at him and tried to smile at him, but could not. Coming suddenly out of that mysterious and terrible world where he had been living for 22 hours, Levin felt himself transported back into his ordinary everyday world of luminous happiness, and he could not bear it. The cord's long tense snapped. He burst into tears, and the sobs of joy which he could not foresee shook his whole body so violently that he could not speak. He knelt beside Kitty and pressed his lips on her hand, and her gentle fingers answered his caress. And meantime, at the foot of the bed, in the skilful hands of Lizaveta Petrovna, like the small uncertain flame of a lamp, flickered the life of a human being, which just before had not been, and which, with every right and every responsibility, would live, and propagate its kind. "He lives! He lives! Yes, it is a boy! Don't be worried," Levin heard Lizaveta's voice saying, while with a trembling hand she slapped the little one's back. "Mamma, is it true?" asked Kitty, and the princess's sobs answered her. And amid the silence, like an indubitable answer to the young mother's questions, was heard a voice, absolutely different from the subdued voices speaking in the room. It was the bold, decided, imperious, almost impertinent cry of the new human being, which had come whence no one knew. Just before, if Levin had been told that Kitty was dead, that he himself had died with her, and that their children were angels, and that they were all in the presence of God, he would not have been surprised. And now that he had come back to reality, it took a prodigious effort of thought to comprehend that his wife was alive, that she was doing well, and that this desperately screeching creature was his son. Kitty was saved, her suffering was past, and he was inexpressibly happy. That he could understand, and it made him happy. But the child, whence? Why? What was it? He could not want himself to the thought of it. It seemed to him somehow too much, too overwhelming, and it was long before he became accustomed to it. End of chapter 15. Part 7, Chapter 16 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. The old prince, Sergey Ivanovitch, and Stepan Arkadyevitch met at Levin's the next morning about 10 o'clock, and after they talked about the little mother, they began to converse about irrelevant topics. Levin listened to them, and involuntarily remembering what had taken place, what had been going on that morning, he also remembered what he himself had been but a few hours before. It was as if 100 years had passed since then. He felt that he was on some unattainable height from which he endeavored to descend to their level, that he might not offend those with whom he was talking. While talking about indifferent things, he was thinking of his wife, of the state of her health, and of his son, to the idea of whose existence he was trying to accustom himself. The whole world of womanhood, which had taken on a new and incomprehensible significance to him, even after his marriage, occupied such a lofty place that he could not begin to realize it. He heard the men talking about their dinner at the club, but he was thinking, "What is she doing now? Is she asleep? How is she? What is in her mind? Is the son Dmitri crying?" And, in the midst of the conversation, in the midst of a sentence, he sprang up and left the room. "Send word down if I may see her," said the old prince. "Very good, I will at once," replied Levin, and without pausing he went to her room. She was not asleep, but was softly talking with her mother, making plans about the christening. With clean clothes and with her hair brushed, she lay comfortably arranged in bed, with her hands resting on the counterpane, and a mob cap with blue ribbons on her head, and as her eyes met his she drew him to her by their look. Her face lighted up more and more brightly as he approached her. There was in it that change from the earthly to the superhuman calm which one sees in death, but, instead of a farewell, she welcomed him to a new life. Again an emotion, like that which he had felt during her agony, seized his heart. She took his hand and asked him if he had slept. He could not answer, but turned his head away, yielding to his weakness. "I have had a nap, Kostya," she said, "and I feel so well now." She looked at him, and suddenly the expression of her face changed. She heard her baby cry. "Give him to me, Lizaveta Petrovna, and let me show him to his father," she said. "There, now, let papa look," said Lizaveta Petrovna, taking up and exhibiting something red, strange, and wobbling. "Wait, we must change it first." And Lizaveta Petrovna deposited this red wobbling something on the bed, and proceeded to unswathe it and then swathe it again, lifting and turning it over with one finger and shaking some kind of powder over it. Levin, as he looked at the poor little bit of humanity, tried in vain to discover within his soul some paternal sentiments toward it. His only feeling was one of repulsion. But when they took off its things and he saw its tiny delicate arms and legs, still saffron-colored, and its still tinier fingers, and even a thumb differentiated from the others, and when he saw Lizaveta Petrovna handling its little waving arms just as if they were delicate springs, and putting them into linen garments, such pity seized him, and such terror lest she should hurt it, that he made a gesture to stop her. Lizaveta Petrovna laughed. Never fear, said she. When the child was dressed and metamorphosed into a regular doll, Lizaveta Petrovna tossed him up and down, as if proud of her work, and held him off so that Levin might see his son in all his beauty. Kitty, not taking her eyes from him, was alarmed. "Give him to me! Give him to me!" she cried, and she even lifted herself up. "But, Katerina Alexandrovna, you must know that any such motions are forbidden. Be patient. I will give him to you, but we must let Papasha see what a fine young man we are." And Lizaveta Petrovna handed to Levin with one hand, the other supported the limp occupant, this strange, weak, red creature, whose head fell limply in its swaddling clothes. All that was to be seen of it was a nose, a pair of eyes that looked in two directions, and smacking lips. "Prekrasnui Rabyonik, a splendid baby," said Lizaveta Petrovna. Levin drew a deep breath of mortification. This splendid baby inspired him only with a feeling of pity and disgust. It was not at all the feeling that he expected. He turned away while the nurse placed it in Kitty's arms. Suddenly a laugh caused him to raise his head. It was Kitty who laughed. The baby had taken the breast. "There, that's enough, said Lizaveta Petrovna, but Kitty would not let go of her son, who had gone to sleep on her arm. "Look at him now," said she, turning the child so that his father might see him. The little old face suddenly grew still more wrinkled, and the child sneezed. Levin, smiling and hardly able to restrain his tears of tenderness, kissed his wife and left the room. The feelings which this little being awakened in him were entirely different from what he had expected. There was neither pride nor joy in the feeling, but rather a new and painful fear. It was the consciousness that he had become vulnerable in a new way, and this consciousness at first was so acute, his fear lest this poor defenseless creature might suffer was so poignant, that it drowned the strange feeling of thoughtless joy and even pride that rose in his heart when the infant sneezed. Chapter 16. Part 7, Chapter 17 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. The affairs of Stepan Arkadyevitch had reached a critical stage. The money brought by the sale of 2/3 of the timber had long ago been spent, and he had obtained from the merchant at a discount of 10% a large part of the remaining third in advance. Now the merchant would not advance anything more, as Dolly, for the first time in her life asserting her rights to her personal property, had refused her signature to the contract when it was proposed to give a receipt for the sale of the last third of the wood. All the salary was used up for household expenses, and for the payment of unavoidable debts. There was absolutely no money to be had. It was disagreeable and awkward, and Stepan Arkadyevitch felt that it was not to be continued. The reason of it, in his opinion, lay in the fact that he got too small a salary. The place which he held had been very good 5 years before, but it was so no longer. Petrov, the director of a bank, got 12,000. Sventitsky, a member of the council, got 17,000. Mitten, the head of a bank, got 50,000. "Apparently I have been asleep and they have forgotten me," said Stepan Arkadyevitch to himself, and he began to keep his eyes and ears open, and at the end of the winter he discovered a very good place, and matured his attack upon it, beginning at Moscow through his uncles, his aunts, and his friends, and then, when the time seemed ripe in the spring, he himself went down to Petersburg. It was one of those lucrative, sinecure places which nowadays are found, varying in importance, worth anything from 1,000 to 50,000 rubles a year. This place was in the commission of the Consolidated Agency for the Mutual Credit Balance of the Southern Railway and Banking Establishments. The place, like all such places, required at once such varied talents and such extraordinary activity that it was hard to find them united in one person. But since it was hopeless to find anyone with all these qualities, it was certainly better that the man put in should be an honest rather than a dishonest man. Now Stepan Arkadyevitch was an honest man in every sense of the term, for in Moscow the word chestnui, meaning honest, has two significations, depending on its accent. They speak of an honest agent, an honest writer, an honest journal, an honest institution, and it means not only that men or institutions are not dishonest, but that they know how to adapt themselves to circumstances. Stepan Arkadyevitch belonged in Moscow to that class of people who used that convenient word, and, as he passed for honest, he therefore felt that he had a better right than anyone else to that place. This place was worth from 7,000 to 10,000 rubles a year, and Oblonsky could accept this position and not resign his present duties. Everything depended on 2 ministers, a lady, and 2 Jews, and, although they were ready to grant what he wished, he had to go to Petersburg to solicit their aid. Moreover, he faithfully promised Anna that he would obtain from Karenin a decisive answer about the divorce, and, having extorted 50 rubles from Dolly, he set out for Petersburg. Sitting in Karenin's library and listening to his exposition of a project for reforming the status of Russian finance, Stepan Arkadyevitch waited as patiently as he could till he might put in a word about his personal affairs and about Anna. "Yes, that is very true," said he, when Alexey Alexandrovitch took off the pince nez, without which he could not read now, and looked inquiringly at his brother-in-law. "That is very true in detail, but nevertheless the leading principle of our age is liberty." "Yes, but I advocate another principle which embraces freedom," replied Alexey Alexandrovitch, accenting the word embraces, and putting on his pince nez to read over the passage where he had said that very thing. And, turning over the pages of his elegantly written manuscript, with its wide margins, he again read the concluding paragraph. "For if I sustain the protectionist system, it is not for the advantage of private individuals, but for the general good, for all classes alike, both low and high. And it is that which they will not understand," added he, looking over his pince-nez at Oblonsky, "absorbed as they are in their personal interests, and so easily satisfied with phrases." Stepan Arkadyevitch knew that when Karenin began to speak of what was said and done by those who were opposed to his views, and who were the source of all evil in Russia, he was nearing the end, and so he willingly renounced his principle of liberty and agreed with him. Alexey Alexandrovitch came to a pause, and turned over the leaves of his manuscript with a thoughtful air. "Oh, by the way," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, "I wanted to ask you, in case you should meet Pomorsky, to say a little word to him for me, that I should very much like to be appointed a member of the commission of the combined agencies of the mutual credit balance of the railways of the South." To Stepan Arkadyevitch the name of this position which was so dear to his heart was already very familiar, and he could rattle it off with great rapidity and without making a mistake. Alexey Alexandrovitch asked what the functions of this new commission were to be, and then he reflected. It seemed to him that the existence of this commission was directly opposed to his projects of reform. But as the operations of this commission were very complicated, and his own projects of reform occupied a very vast field, he felt that he could not settle this question at a glance, and, taking off his pince-nez, said, "Without doubt I could speak to him. But why are you especially desirous to have this place?" "The salary is good, 9,000 rubles, and my means—" "9,000 rubles," repeated Alexey Alexandrovitch, and he frowned. The high emolument of this position reminded him that Stepan Arkadyevitch's supposititious function was directly opposed to the principal feature of his projects, which always inclined to economy. "I believe, and I show in my pamphlet, that in our day these enormous salaries are the signs of the defectiveness of the economic assiette of our administration." "Yes, but what would you have?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Now let us see. A bank director gets 10,000. He is worth it. Or an engineer gets 20,000. These are no sinecures." "I opine that salaries are payment for merchandise, and ought to be subject to the law of supply and demand. If salaries are not subject to this law, if, for example, I see two engineers of equal capacity having pursued the same studies at the Institute, one receiving 40,000 rubles while the other contents himself with 2,000, or if I see a hussar who has no special knowledge become director of a bank with a phenomenal salary, I conclude that these salaries are fixed, not in accordance with the law of supply and demand, but by sheer partiality. And so, here is an abuse, great in itself and disastrous in its influence on the imperial service. I opine—" Stepan Arkadyevitch made haste to interrupt his brother-in-law. "Yes, but you will agree that a new and undoubtedly useful institution has been opened. It's a live thing, and it is certainly worth while to have it conducted honestly," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, emphasizing the adjective. But the Muscovite signification of the adjective had no force for Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Honesty is only negative merit," he replied. "But you will do me a great favor, nevertheless," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, "if you will speak a little word to Pomorsky, when you happen to meet him, you know." "Yes, certainly. But it seems to me that this depends more on Bulgarinoff," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Bulgarinoff on his part is well disposed," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, reddening. Stepan Arkadyevitch reddened at the remembrance of Bulgarinoff, because that very morning he had been at the Jew's house, and this visit had remained as an unpleasant recollection. Stepan Arkadyevitch knew perfectly well that the commission of which he wished to become a member was a new, important, and honorable enterprise. But that morning, when Bulgarinoff, evidently with malice prepense, kept him with other petitioners waiting in his reception room for 2 hours, the whole affair became awkward to him. Whether it was awkward to him that he, a descendant of Rurik, a Prince of Vronsky, had to wait 2 hours in the Jew's reception room, or because he, for the first time in his life, was not following the example of his ancestors in serving the government, but had got into a new field, at all events it was awkward. During these 2 hours of waiting at Bulgarinoff's, Stepan Arkadyevitch, briskly walking up and down through the reception room, smoothing his side whiskers, occasionally entering into conversation with the other petitioners, and trying to work out a pun on his long waiting at the Jew's, diligently concealed from the others, and also from himself, the trying feeling. But all that time he felt awkward and annoyed. He did not know why. It was either because he had not succeeded very well with his pun on the word Jew, how he had to chew on the cud of expectation, or for some other reason. When at last Bulgarinoff, with excessive humility, received him, evidently triumphing in his humiliation, and almost refused his request, Stepan Arkadyevitch made haste to forget it all. But now, remembering it again, he reddened with shame. Chapter 17. Part 7, Chapter 18 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Now I have yet one more thing to talk over with you, and you know what it is about. Anna, said Stepan Arkadyevitch, after a moment's silence, and shaking off these disagreeable memories. When Oblonsky spoke Anna's name, Karenin's face entirely changed. In place of its former vivacity, it took on an expression of corpse-like rigidity and weariness. "What more do you want of me?" said he, turning about on his armchair and shutting his pince-nez. "A decision, some sort of a decision, Alexey Alexandrovitch. I address you, not as," he was going to say, "a deceived husband," but fearing that it might hurt his cause he stopped, and substituted with little appropriateness, not as a statesman, but simply as a man, and a good man, and a Christian. You ought to have pity on her." "In what way could I, properly?" asked Karenin quietly. "Yes, have pity on her. If you saw her as I do, I have seen her all winter, you would pity her. Her position is cruel." "I thought," said Karenin suddenly, in a piercing, almost whining voice, "that Anna Arkadyevna had obtained all that she wished." "Oh, Alexey Alexandrovitch, for God's sake, let us not make recriminations. What is past is past, and you know what she is now waiting for and hoping for is the divorce." "But I understood that in case I kept my son, Anna Arkadyevna refused the divorce, and so my silence was equivalent to a reply, and I thought the question settled. I consider it settled," said he, with more and more warmth. "For God's sake don't get angry," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, touching his brother-in-law's knee. "This question is not settled. If you will allow me to recapitulate, the affair stands thus. When you separated, you were as great, as magnanimous as was possible to be. You granted her everything, her freedom, even a divorce if she wanted one. She appreciated it. No, you don't think so, but she appreciated it absolutely. To such a degree that, at first, feeling her guilt towards you, she could not, reason about it at all. She refused everything. But the reality and time have shown her that her position is painful and intolerable." "Anna Arkadyevna's life cannot interest me," said Karenin, raising his eyebrows. "Permit me to disbelieve that," replied Stepan Arkadyevitch gently. "Her position is painful to her, and without any escape whatever. She deserves it, you say. She acknowledges that, and does not complain. She says up and down that she should never dare to ask anything of you. But I, and all her relatives, all who love her, beg and implore you to have pity on her. Why should she suffer? Whose advantage is it?" "Excuse me, you seem to accuse me of being to blame." "Oh, not at all, not at all. Understand me," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, touching Karenin's arm, as if he believed that personal contact would have a mollifying effect on his brother-in-law. "I merely say this. Her position is painful, and you can relieve it, and it will not cost you anything. I will so arrange the matter that you shall have no trouble about it. Besides, you have promised." "My consent has been already given, and I had supposed that the question of our son had decided the matter. Besides, I hoped that Anna Arkadyevna would in her turn have the generosity to understand—" His trembling lips could hardly utter the words, and he turned pale. "She leaves all to your magnanimity. She asks, she implores, for only one thing, to be relieved from this unendurable position in which she finds herself. She asks for her son. Alexey Alexandrovitch, you are a good man. Just enter for a moment into her feelings. The question of the divorce is for her a matter of life or death. If you had not given your promise, she would have been resigned to her situation and lived in the country. But you did give your promise, and she wrote you and came to Moscow. And there in Moscow, where every familiar face was a knife in her heart, she has been living for 6 months, every day expecting an answer. Her situation is that of a condemned criminal who for months has had the rope around his neck, and does not know whether he is to expect pardon or execution. Pity her, and, besides, I will take care to arrange all. Vos scrupules." "I am not speaking of that, not of that," said Alexey Alexandrovitch with some disgust. "But perhaps I promised more than I had the right to promise." "Then you refuse to do what you have promised?" "I never refused to do all that I could, but I must have time to consider how far what I promised is permissible." "No, Alexey Alexandrovitch," said Oblonsky, leaping to his feet. "I do not wish to believe this. She is as unhappy as it is possible for a woman to be, and you cannot refuse such. How far what I promised is permissible? Vous professez d'être un libre penseur, but I, as a believer, cannot defy the law of Christianity in a matter so important." "But in Christian communities, and here in Russia, divorce is permitted," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Divorce is permitted by our church, and we see—" "Permitted, but not in this sense." "Alexey Alexandrovitch, I don't know you," said Oblonsky, after a moment's silence. "You are not the same man you were. Do you not forgive all? And did we not appreciate your magnanimity? Were you not moved by genuine Christian feeling? Weren't you ready to sacrifice everything? You yourself said, 'If any man will take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also.' And now—" "I beg of you," said Karenin, rising suddenly and turning pale with a trembling jaw. "I beg of you," he said in a high-pitched voice, to cut short this conversation." "Oh, well, pardon me, if I have offended you," said Stepan Arkadyevitch in confusion, holding out his hand. "But I had to fulfill the mission I was charged with." Alexey Alexandrovitch gave him his hand and said, after a moment's reflection, "I must have time to think about it, and seek for light. You shall have my final answer day after tomorrow." Chapter 19. Part 7, Chapter 19 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Stepan Arkadyevitch was going out when Kornei came in and announced, "Sergey Alexeyevitch." "Who is Sergey Alexeyevitch?" Oblonsky began to ask, but in an instant he remembered. "Oh, Seroza!" he exclaimed. "And here was I thinking it was some director of a department," he said to himself. "Anna begged me to see him." And he recalled the sad, timid expression with which, as he left her, Anna had said to him, "You will see him, and can find out what he is doing, and where he is, and who is taking care of him. And, Stiva, if possible, would it be possible?" He knew what she meant by the words, "if possible." If it were possible to get the divorce so as to have her son. But now Stepan Arkadyevitch knew that this was out of the question. He was none the less glad to see his nephew again. Alexey Alexandrovitch reminded his brother-in-law that he must not talk to him of his mother, and begged him not even by a word to remind him of her. "He was very ill after that last interview with his mother, which we were not prepared for," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, "and for a while we feared for his life. But sensible medical treatment and sea bathing in the summer restored him to health, and I have followed the doctor's advice and sent him to school. Activity, being with companions of his own age, have had a happy influence on him. His health is good, and he is studying well." "Why, he's becoming quite a young man. He is no longer Seroza. He is full grown, Sergey Alexeyevitch," said Stepan Arkadyevitch with a smile, as a handsome, tall, robust boy, dressed in a kurtochka or jacket and long trousers, came in briskly and without constraint. The boy had a look of sound health and good spirits. He bowed to his uncle as to a stranger. Then, as he remembered him, he reddened and, as if offended and angry at something, turned away, and handed his school report to his father. "Well, that is excellent," said Karenin. "You now may go and play." "He has grown tall and slender, and lost his childish look, and become a real boy. I like it," remarked Stepan Arkadyevitch with a smile. "Do you remember me?" The boy quickly glanced at his father. "I remember you, mon oncle," answered the boy, looking at Stepan Arkadyevitch and then casting down his eyes. The uncle called the lad to him and took his hand. "Well, how are you?" he asked, wanting to talk but not knowing what to say. The boy, blushing and not answering, hastily withdrew his hand, and, as soon as his uncle had released it, flew away like a bird set free. A year had passed since Seroza had seen his mother for the last time. During this time he had not even heard anything about her. He had been sent to school, and had become acquainted with boys of his own age, and learned to like them. His dreams and recollections about his mother, which after his interview with her had made him ill, now no longer occupied his mind. When they recurred to him he even tried to get rid of them, regarding them as disgraceful for a boy and fit only for girls. He knew that his parents had quarrelled and parted, and that he must accustom himself to the idea of remaining with his father. The sight of his uncle, who looked like his mother, was unpleasant to him, because it awakened memories which caused him shame, and it was still more unpleasant, because, from certain words which he had caught as he entered the door, and by the peculiar expression of his father's and his uncle's faces, he knew that they were talking about his mother. And so as not to blame his father, with whom he lived and on whom he was dependent, and especially so as not to give way to a sentiment which he felt was too degrading, he tried not to look at his uncle, who had come to disturb his tranquillity, and not to think of the past. But when, shortly after, Stepan Arkadyevitch went out, he found the boy on the stairs, and he called him to him, and asked him how he spent his spare time, now that he was at school. Seroza, out of his father's presence, talked freely. "We have a railroad now," he said in answer to his question. "Just see, these two are sitting on the seat. They are passengers, and there is one man trying to stand on the seat, and there they all are going, and by means of our arms and our belts we go through the whole length of the hall, and the doors open in front. And I tell you it's very hard here for the conductor." "Is that the one standing?" asked Stepan Arkadyevitch, amused. "Yes, he has to be bold and skillful, because the train comes to a very sudden stop, and he might get thrown over." "Well, that is no joke," said Stepan Arkadyevitch sadly, as he looked at the boy's bright eyes, which were like his mother's, and which had already lost their childish look of innocence. And, although he had promised Alexey Alexandrovitch not to speak of Anna, he could not resist. "Do you remember your mother?" he asked suddenly. "No, I do not," Seroza answered quickly, turning red, and his uncle could not make him talk any more. When the Russian tutor found Seroza on the stairs half an hour after, he could not make out whether he was crying or was sulky. "Did you hurt yourself when you fell?" he asked. "I said this was a dangerous game, and shall I have to tell your father?" "If I had, no one should find it out," answered the boy. "Well, what's the matter then?" "Let me alone. What is it to him whether I remember or not? Why did he remind me? Let me be!" And the boy seemed to defy not only his tutor, but the whole world. Chapter 19. Part 7, Chapter 20 of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Nathan Haskell Doyle. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne Spiegel. Stepan Arkadyevitch, as usual, did not waste his time at Petersburg. He had not only his business to attend to, his sister's divorce and his new position to look after, but moreover, as he said, to refresh himself after musty Moscow. For Moscow, in spite of its cafés chantants and its omnibuses, was still only a stagnant marsh. Stepan Arkadyevitch always felt that this was so. Living in Moscow, especially in proximity to his family, he was conscious that his spirit flagged. When his life in Moscow was long unbroken by a trip to Petersburg, he even began to be annoyed by his wife's bad temper and reproaches, and to worry over his health, the education of his children, and the petty details of the household. He even went so far as to be disturbed about his debts. As soon as he set foot in Petersburg and entered that circle where life was really life, and not vegetating, as in Moscow, immediately all such thoughts disappeared like wax in the fire. His wife? He had just been talking with Prince Tchetchensky. Prince Tchetchensky had a wife and a family, grown-up boys, pages now, and he had another establishment, outside the law, and in this also there were children. But, though the first family was well enough in a way, Prince Tchetchensky felt happier with his second family, and he had introduced his oldest legitimate son into his other family. He told Stepan Arkadyevitch he considered it a good way to train him and develop him. What would have been said about that in Moscow? Children. In Petersburg fathers didn't trouble themselves with their children. Children were educated in institutions, and there was no sign of that crazy notion in vogue in Moscow (Lvov shared in it) that children should have all the luxuries and their parents nothing but care and trouble. The government service? The service, too, was not that tiresome, hopeless treadmill that it was in Moscow. Here there was interest in the service, meetings with men in authority, mutual services, opportune words spoken, the knowledge of how to take advantage of chances, and a man might suddenly find himself high in his career, like Bryanzev, whom Stepan Arkadyevitch met that evening, and who was now a leading dignitary. Yes, there was something interesting in the service here. The Petersburg views about money especially appealed to Stepan Arkadyevitch. Bartnyansky, who had spent at least 50,000 rubles, judging by the rate at which he was living, made a remark which deeply impressed him. Just before dinner, as they were talking together, Stepan Arkadyevitch had said, "You seem to have some connection with Mordvinsky. You might do me a favor. Please say a little word to him in my behalf. It is a place which I should like to have. Member of the commission." "Well, I won't forget. Only what pleasure can you have in attending to this railroad business with the Jews? Of course, if you want it. But still, it's a wretched business." Stepan Arkadyevitch did not say to him that it was no sinecure. Bartnyansky would not have known what he meant. "I need money. I must have something to live on." "But don't you live, then?" "Yes, but in debt." "Much?" asked Bartnyansky sympathetically. "Yes, 20,000 rubles." Bartnyansky broke out into a gay laugh. "Oh, happy man! I have 1.5 million of debts, and not a ruble, and as you see, I live all the same." And Stepan Arkadyevitch saw that this was not mere words, but was actually true. Zhivankov was in debt 300,000, and had not a kopeck. Petrovsky had spent 5 millions, and yet went on living just as before, and had charge of the finances, and had only 20,000 salary. Petersburg had a delightful physical influence on Stepan Arkadyevitch. It made him feel younger. In Moscow he sometimes detected gray hairs. He would fall asleep after dinner. It made him breathe hard to go upstairs. He was dull in the company of young women. He no longer danced at balls. At Petersburg he experienced what the 60-year-old Prince Pyotr Oblonsky, who had just returned from abroad, told him one evening. "We don't know how to live here," said Pyotr Oblonsky. "For example, I spent the summer at Baden, and now, honestly, I feel like a new man. I see a young woman, and I enjoy my dinner. I can take my wine. I'm well and vigorous. When I come back to Russia, I have to see my wife, have even to go into the country. You wouldn't believe it, but in a couple of weeks I am in my dressing gown. Goodbye to the young beauties. I am old. Think only of the salvation of my soul. To make me over, I go to Paris." Stepan Arkadyevitch felt the same difference as Pyotr Oblonsky did. In Moscow he reached such a low ebb of vitality that he felt sure that, if he ever attained the same age, he too should be driven to thinking about the salvation of his soul. In Petersburg he was conscious of being a well-regulated man. Between the Princess Betsy Tversky and Stepan Arkadyevitch there had been for a long time a very strange relationship. He always jested with her, and he always said very improper things by way of jest, knowing that they pleased her more than anything else. The day after his interview with Karenina, Stepan Arkadyevitch went to see her, and, feeling particularly young, he conducted himself with more than his usual levity, and went so far in his impropriety that he could not retrieve his steps, and, unfortunately, he felt that she was not only displeased, but even opposed to him. Yet this tone had been established because it generally amused her. So he was glad to have the Princess Myakaya interrupt their tête-à-tête. "Ah, here you are," said she when she saw him. "Well, and how is your poor sister? Don't look at me so. Since women who are 1,000 times worse than she throw stones at her, I think she did quite right. I can't forgive Vronsky for not letting me know that she was in Petersburg. I should have gone to see her, and gone with her everywhere. Give her my love. Now tell me about her." "Well, her position is a very painful one. Stepan Arkadyevitch began, in the simplicity of his heart, taking the princess's words as genuine money, when she said, "Tell me about your sister." But the princess, in her usual way, interrupted him and began to talk herself. "She did what everybody but myself does, and hides. But she was not willing to lie, and she did right. And she has at least bettered herself in having forsaken that imbecile, I beg your pardon, your brother-in-law. Everybody said he was a genius. A genius! I was the only one who said he was a goose. And people have come to be of my opinion, now that he has taken up with the Countess Lydia and Landau. I should not like to agree with everybody. It's stupid. But this time I can't help it." "Now please explain something to me," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "What does this mean? Yesterday I was at his house, talking of the divorce, and I asked him for a definite answer. My brother-in-law said to me that he could not give me an answer without reflection. And this morning I received an invitation from Lydia Ivanovna for this evening, instead of an answer." "Now, that's just it!" cried the princess, delighted. "They will consult Landau as to what to say." "Why Landau? Who is Landau?" "What? You don't know Jules Landau? La femme Jules Landau, la clairvoyante? He also, in my opinion, is an imbecile. But on him depends your sister's fate. That's what comes of living in the provinces. Landau, you must know, was commis of a mercantile house at Paris, and went to see a doctor. He fell asleep in the waiting room, and, while he was asleep, gave advice to all the sick. Most astonishing advice. Then Yuri Melyadinsky's wife, you know, he was sick, called him to see her husband. He treated her husband. In my opinion he didn't do him any good, for Melyadinsky is just as sick as he was before, but his wife and he believe in Landau. They took him into their house. They brought him to Russia. Naturally, people here have thrown themselves at him. He treats everybody. He cured the Countess Bezubov, and she fell so in love with him that she has adopted him." "How? Adopted him?" "Yes, adopted him. He isn't Landau any more, but Count Bezubov. But Lydia, and I like her very much in spite of her crankiness, must needs be smitten with him, and nothing that she and Alexey Alexandrovitch take up is decided without consulting him. Your sister's fate is, therefore, in the hands of this Count Bezubov, alias Landau." Chapter 21.